Hello and welcome to the Authentic Freedom Virtual Church. My name is Lori Lumby and I am the pastor and spiritual director of this online community. Let me take a moment to read to you from our mission statement. We are a community of men and women who consider Jesus to be our teacher, while honoring the spiritual truths inherent within all sacred traditions. We recognize the divine as that which is at once outside of us, within us, and present within all of creation, and which can be acknowledged by any name, image, or presence. We believe in the inherent potential of all human beings to become self-actualized and acknowledge the spiritual journey as a formative tool in this endeavor. We believe in the law of love and seek to know more fully the love of the divine that dwells within us and which seeks to be known in the world through us in service to the betterment of our world. Let's pause for a moment in silence to prepare our hearts and our minds to receive God's nourishment for us today. If today you hear God's voice, harden not your heart. If today you hear God's voice, harden not your heart. Today's service is in celebration of the fourth Sunday of Easter, and this week we are taking time with the story of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Last week we had an opportunity in the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus to be reminded of the invitation to look for God and to be open to all the ways in which we have an opportunity to see and know the presence and action of God in our very midst. In last week's reading, we had an opportunity to pierce through our resistance and frustration and our fear of not acknowledging or recognizing the presence of God. In this week's reading, Jesus speaks to us about his role as shepherd. Specifically, he talks about God as being the gatekeeper, Jesus as being the shepherd, and we as being the sheep. In this week's reading, we are reminded of all the opportunities we have to hear the voice of God and to know that as children of God, that we have the capability of hearing God's voice. For Christians, there are many ways in which we have opportunities to hear God's voice. First, we have an opportunity to hear God's voice through Scripture. And specifically, we have an opportunity to hear God's voice not necessarily through somebody else's interpretation of Scripture, but through contemplative practices that have been part of the Christian tradition for 2,000 years. Specific contemplative practices that help us to be open to hearing God's unique voice for each of us. For God speaks to each and every one of us in a unique and special way. Two of the specific contemplative practices that are part of the Christian tradition are Lectio Divina and Imagination Contemplation. These are both practices which give us an opportunity to read Scripture and to hear how God is speaking individually and personally to us through these sacred words. It gives us an opportunity to hear God's unique truth for each of us individually, knowing that God created no two of us to be the same, but that God would speak to us in unique and special ways. And through both Lectio Divina and Imagination Contemplation, we have an opportunity to be open to hearing God's voice. In addition to Scripture, in the Christian tradition, we have an opportunity to hear God's voice through music. In the past 2,000 years, chants and hymns have been composed which speak God's truth to us. both through the words themselves and through the sounds and the vibrations that have been divinely infused in this music. I think in a particular way of some of the sacred hymns composed by Mozart or Bach, or my personal favorite, the chants that have been composed by Hildegard of Bingen, a 10th century mystic who composed music that gives us the ability to transcend normal human consciousness and to be able to hear God's voice in our lives. Beyond scripture and music, we have an opportunity to hear God's voice through inspirational readings and poetry. God speaks to us not just in the devotional writings of Christian saints or mystics, but also through the way in which God speaks through divine language to all mystics across all traditions. I have found comfort personally in many of the inspirational readings in modern day texts, along with some of the sacred poetry that was composed by some of the Middle Eastern mystics like Rumi and Hafiz. God's voice transcends denomination, and we have an opportunity to hear God's voice in all kinds of readings, if we are open in mind and heart, and if we approach these readings with that intention. And finally, we have the opportunity and invitation to hear God's voice in silence. In the Christian tradition, there is a rich tradition of contemplative prayer that invites us to enter into silence. Centering prayer is one form of contemplative prayer that is grounded in the practice of silence. Through centering prayer, we allow ourselves to simply sit in stillness, and to be open to how God might speak to us in the silence of our minds and in the silence of our hearts. So in this reading, reading from this week, we are reminded to take time in our lives to set time aside to listen for God, to listen for God's unique voice, unique nourishment, inspiration, and support that is present to us in scripture, in music, in inspirational reading and poetry, and in silence. But even more than that, God's voice is present everywhere. There is not a place or an experience in our life where God is not speaking. The invitation for us is simply to be open to all the possible ways that God is speaking to us, and to be open to risk believing in God's words. The reading this week ends with one very important line that I think is transformative and something that can carry us in the coming week. And the line is this: Jesus said, "I came so that they might have life and have it abundantly." The abundance that Jesus speaks of is an interior state. It is an interior state of peace, contentment, delight, and wonder. And in this state of abundance, we know God and we know ourselves. This is the abundance that Jesus promised to us, and the abundance that he came to remind us of how to attain it. As we go forward this week, we are invited to be open to that abundance and to know that we find that abundance in the present moment. We find that abundance in remembering our connection with God. We find that abundance in remembering that we are love. And so as we go forward this week, let us listen to the voice of the Good Shepherd, who calls us to live life and to live life abundantly, in an abundance of joy, wonder, delight, and peace. And I want to close this session today with one of my favorite psalms, which speaks to us of God as the Good Shepherd, of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. God is my shepherd, so nothing shall I want. I rest in the meadows of faithfulness and love. I walk by the quiet waters of peace. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. Thank you for taking time out of your busy life to receive this message of nourishment and support. And if you found this message to be inspirational, meaningful, and supportive of your own journey towards peace and fulfillment, I invite you to make a donation to Authentic Freedom Ministries, and you can do that through this website. Thank you again for taking this time out for yourself, and may God's love and blessing be with you in the coming days.